Start the recording. Okay. We are going to finish up on what I started last week on circuit breakers, or those things that disrupt communication. And remember the diagram I gave you last week. Here you are trying to send a message or communication to somebody, and here are all these different things that can get in the way to distort the message, circuit breakers. And we covered about 12 of them last week, and we want to cover some more tonight as we finish up on the circuit breakers. So let's go ahead and begin with Proverbs 18, verse 23. And all of these are in the book of Proverbs. 18:23 says this: The poor man utters supplications, but the rich man answers roughly. So what do you see as the circuit breaker there, or something that would hinder communication? Well, it's the person who answers roughly, harsh in their tone or in their words. But there is a contrast in that verse, is there not? You have the contrast between a poor man and a rich man. And I think part of our understanding for this verse is that someone who answers roughly, harshly, might be influenced because of their station in life, because of their financial position, because of power that they perceive that they might have. And I think we've all, at times, have had employers who just were out of touch in how to communicate with those underneath them. And they justified their gruffness and their rough speech and the way they treated people because I'm the boss. I can do that. So, one way to hinder communication, and we've looked at this from a couple of different angles, is the tone of our voices, the words that we speak, the roughness that could be there. Remember on Sunday we talked about the two Boams. You had Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam would fall into this first verse here, okay? He was a person in leadership. He was the heir appointed to the throne of Israel. And so when Jeroboam came to him and made the supplication that, hey, we're willing to come back and serve you, but you got to lighten up. And of course, we know the story that Rehoboam tried to exalt himself higher than his father Solomon. When he said, "My father disciplined you with whips, I'm going to discipline you with scorpions." And of course, take a look at what happened with that communication. Jeroboam left and took 10 tribes with him. Then in chapter 19, verse 1, better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than he who is perverse in speech and is a fool. Now, again, look at the contrast that is here. So when you think of perverse, what comes to your mind? What word picture, what mental image comes to your mind? And I had to look up this word because we all have our cultural definitions of words today that oftentimes are quite different from the original language. Now, keep in mind that we have the Hebrew text in front of us that has been translated into English. But the word perverse here in the Hebrew means twisted. Twisted. Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity or uprightness than he who is twisted in his speech and is a fool, or who is twisted in his speech and demonstrates he is a fool. Our speech reveals a lot about us, doesn't it? That's what Proverbs says. Our words can either be healing or hurtful. They can either stimulate to good works and to love, or they can be destructive and hurtful. So we have a person here trying to communicate, but his language, his speech, what he is saying is twisted. It is not accurate. There's a bent to it, and it shows his foolishness. And I think, again, many of us have been involved in talking with somebody, and their speech has been bent. It has been twisted. And you know this pretty clearly because what they're saying doesn't make sense. What they are saying doesn't apply to the situation, to the problem, to the project that you might be trying to resolve. And it only demonstrates their foolishness and demonstrates they have not clearly thought through the situation that is before them. Verse 5 of the same chapter, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape. I think this is pretty clear as far as what hinders communication is someone who is a false witness, someone who doesn't tell the truth. Now, in Ephesians, we are commanded to put away lying and to tell the truth, put away falsehood, what it says in Ephesians chapter 4. The idea behind falsehood and the concept behind here as well is not solely, it's not just lying, not telling the truth. We can be false when we exaggerate the truth, when we misrepresent the truth, when we only give partial truth to what we are saying. And so that hinders communication. And when that is exposed in a relationship, the person hearing the falsehoods that has taken place, the subtle deception in not declaring the whole truth, they become weary, they become reserved, they become hesitant to have an honest dialogue, and more hesitant to believe what the person is saying. It goes on to say, and he who tells lies will not escape. So here it's connected together. Somebody who is a false witness is someone who is lying. And the encouragement for us is that will be punished. Somehow God will bring forth the truth of the situation, and the lie, the falsehood will be exposed, and it will be cared for. Why? Because God is the God of truth, and he expects his people to be truthful as well. In chapter 20, verse 19, and again, if you've got some comments, jump in here. Verse 19, he who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a gossip. Now, this is an interesting Hebrew word picture here. He who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. So we know a slanderer is attacking someone's character. And one way to do this, according to this verse here, is to reveal a secret. So we're breaking confidence of something that has been shared with us. But the idea behind slanderer, the Hebrew picture behind slanderer is this: flattery. Flattery. He who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. They flatter in their speech in order to earn an audience with somebody so they can spread gossip. That was very interesting as I researched that as that came up. And then in verse 25, it is a trap for a man to say rashly, it is holy, and after the vows to make inquiry. chapter 20, verse 25. See if I got that correct. I think I do. I'm going to check my source that I've been using here. I guess I should talk instead of letting all this silence take place. Okay, here we go. Yeah, Proverbs 20, 25. Okay, I typed it right. And I'm in the right chapter. Okay. It is a trap for a man to say rashly, it is holy, and after the vows to make inquiry. I think we can walk away with the idea of a presumptuous statement that is made as if it is truth. And then later the person goes and makes inquiry and discovers that what he has said is not truth. So in order to prevent this situation from taking place, to discover that, oh, gee, what I said was not true, to make sure, as we've looked at other verses, that make sure that we have all of the information, make sure that we have as much of the data that we need to process with a level of maturity and understanding exactly what the situation is, that I might be able to address it with spiritual knowledge and discernment, not rashly, not claiming something is holy. This is God's will for your life. And then realize that, wait a minute, I had one verse and I took it out of context. And the overall understanding of Scripture is this. Let me give you an example. A good friend of mine back in Kansas City, he is a retired KC police officer, married, and I think he had 12 children. Unfortunately, he was not always the loving father and husband. He could be harsh. And over the years, this built up into bitterness in his wife's life and in his children's life, coupled with the wife's influence on the children, speaking negatively about their father. Long story short, it resulted in a divorce and such a huge, huge mess that took place. And he has been dealing with this in many different levels for close to, I believe, 10 years now. I just got a call from him the other day, and he asked me a question, whether he had a couple of scriptures, and he thought that it gave him permission to pursue a romantic relationship. Now, he has been involved with an organization that goes over to Nicaragua, and they do work over there. And evidently, he has struck up a friendship with a lady who is 10 years his senior, and they really enjoy one another's company. And when he was back here in the States, there was a lady who was looking for a little bit more than let's go out and see a movie and have dinner. And so he gave me one or two verses that said, well, doesn't this mean that I'm free, that I can go ahead and cultivate a romantic relationship and see where it goes? And I had to point out to him the context of the verses that he shared with me and provide some insight that way. Not that I've got the handle on insight like this, but he needed to be reminded of things that he had studied and that he and I had studied over the years. And thankfully, the Lord was working, and he responded back to me saying, Rick, I appreciate that. You readjusted my compass here, and I just need to enjoy the friendship, and I've got to guard my own heart, my own mind for purity. And that's the idea here, where people were telling him, hey, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Now, I know there is division in fundamentalism about the whole issue of marriage and divorce and remarriage. I'm not going to get into that. This is not the forum for that. I understand that. Every man has to be persuaded in his own mind based on the scriptures. And I've struggled this for all of the years of ministry that I've been involved with. And at one time, I swaggered a little bit off to the right side. And I had to go back and wrestle with it and look at it and get God to refresh me on the topic. And I know where I stand, and I have my convictions for it. And if somebody asks me, I'll tell them what I believe the Bible has to say. But all of that simply to illustrate, be careful that you do not declare something holy if you don't have all the information on the situation. It is better to say, you know what, I'm not sure on that. Let me go research it. Let me go study it out. And I'll come back to you with what the scriptures have to say. Chapter 25, verse 24. Chapter 25, verse 24. It is better to live in the corner of the roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Now, I'll tell you what, there are some preachers who just love to camp on this verse because it's mentioned 2 or 3 times in the book of Proverbs, and they will thump the pulpit. It is better to live in the corner of a house or up on the roof or in the basement than with a contentious woman. Well, let's take a look at the verse, okay? The idea of being contentious can apply to a man, not just a woman. And the idea of contentious means to be one who is given to strife, one who is given to quarreling, to bickering, to finding fault. That's contentious. Stirring up the pot, if you please. And a lot of times this is done because the wife has expectations that have not been met by the husband, and or her expectations are way beyond biblically rooted. So she has a higher expectation than God has in his word for this person. And so there's disappointment. And there is promises made, or there are statements made by the husband, I'll try better. I'll try better. I'll work on it this way. I'll do this. I'll do this. I'll do this. And then there is the repeated failure that takes place. Now, 2 things along this. The husband needs to pledge to follow the Lord in whatever situation there is a point of contention with the wife about his conduct or behavior. He needs to get before God. God is the one that will change the husband, not the wife. So what does the wife do between now and the time that the husband responds to God? She needs to commit it to the Lord and be a faithful wife. She needs to be a Proverbs 31 woman. I was a workaholic. I was very determined. I thought I was doing that which was best for my family when we were first married, and we're down in Florida with 2 little girls. And my wife came to a point to understand that she could not change me. As much as she cried, as much as she pleaded, as much as she threw the frying pan or whatever else that she did, she came to a point where I can't change this man. And she found solace, comfort, and a refuge in turning me over to God to begin to revitalize my life, to conform me more to the image of Jesus Christ. And I've heard her say this oftentimes to ladies in the churches that we have been involved with, even as late as 1 or 2 ladies here at Moxie's. She has given that advice to them when they have complained about their husbands. That's the idea here: contentious, argumentative, finding, fault finding, disappointment that turns into bitterness. It's the burr underneath the saddle. It's the raspberry seed caught in your tooth. It's the flake of dust that gets caught in your eye, and it irritates. That's the idea here, and that breaks down communication. Why do you want to talk to somebody who's always pointing out your faults? Why do you want to have a conversation with that? That's why it says go to the corner of the house, go to the basement. 26, verse 18 and 19. 26, 18 and 19. Like a madman. Now watch the comparisons here. Like a madman who throws fires, arrows, and death. You got the picture? Here is this lunatic who has been armed with weapons that cause destruction, hurt, and harm. He's out of his mind. So, verse 19, see the comparison? So is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, was I not joking? So the person that comes along and is throwing these verbal darts and firebrands and arrows, these attacking things, when confronted, will say, oh, I was just kidding. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking. Can't you take a joke? Well, in essence, no, because you have attacked a person's character. 20 and 21 of the same chapter, for lack of wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no whisperer, contention dies down. Now, I've had enough experience with, not as much as some of you guys, but I've had enough experience with fireplaces and with wood and keeping the stove going or stoking it at night. So in the morning when you wake up, it hasn't died out. You have at least a bed of embers where you can build on that and get the fire back up and get the house warmed up. That's the contrast here. How do I deal with a problem in a relationship of communication? You need to remove the whisperer. You need to remove the wood. That's what's stoking this situation. And it will quiet down according to this verse. Verse 19, a similar illustration. Like charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. See that word contention? It's not just applied to women in verse 24 of the last chapter. Now it's applied to man. Someone who is always stirring up trouble and difficulty. Well, how do you deal with that? Get rid of the contentious person or the issue that is causing contention. Now, in reality here, sometimes you can't get rid of the contentious spirit that a person has. They are just bound and determined. This is the way I think it should be, and you are doing it all wrong. And until you come to your senses and do it my way, I'm going to continue to remind you that you're doing it the wrong way. Well, either come to an agreement that who's in charge of this project, you or me? If I have been given charge of this project, I welcome your input, but I'm the one that makes the final decision about how to operate this project, as long as it is not, my decisions do not create any point of harm. If it is a cooperative project and we are to be working on it together, then we need to come to an agreement about what exactly is the goal to accomplish. Because sometimes, beloved, you can have 2 or 3 different ways to accomplish the goal, and none of those ways are wrong. None of those ways are wrong. So the goal has to be kept in mind, and there has to be a blending of skill and personalities. A lot of times when a project gets tanked, it's because of a personality. Somebody's ego is getting stepped on or they feel that way. And the project gets tanked because they can't set themselves aside in order for the project to be accomplished. Verse 22 says this of chapter 26. The words of a whisperer are like dainty morsels, and they go down into the innermost parts of the body. One of the ways that communication gets jammed up can be pictured like you are at a 3.5-star restaurant, 4-star restaurant, and they've got the buffet set out, right? And you got the salad buffet, and you go up there and you pile up your plate with all your goodies. And then they come by and take that plate out, and they usher you to the main line where you've got all your different meats and potatoes and gravies and all the other good stuff there. And so you load up on that, and you finish up, and they come by and they take your plates away, and they say, oh, there's the dessert bar over there. Please go help yourself to whatever you want. So you look for those dainty morsels, those real sweet things that you would never buy for yourself because you couldn't afford them, but there they are sitting right there in front of you. Oh, they look so delicious. They're so tempting. They go down so easily. That's the picture in verse 22 about the words of a whisperer. They're like dainty morsels, very attractive. Oh, something that gives me enough to whet my appetite to want to know more. And that hinders communication. All right, we took a look at verse 22. Chapter 28, verse 2. By the transgression of a land, many are its princes, but by a man of understanding and knowledge, so it endures. I've got to be honest with you. I don't quite know how this fits in to circuit breakers for communication. The idea of transgression is a deliberate violation of a boundary. So by the deliberate violation of a boundary of a land, many are its princes. So what are we squabbling over? Territory. We're having a battle of what people think is theirs. And you know what? That can come out in communication, can it? That rights issue can come out in communication and cause difficulties in trying to get a concept, get a principle across. Rights. And this is something that every Christian, I believe, needs to determine in their life. They need to answer this question. Do I have rights? Do I have rights? And I have asked a lot of people this question. Even in my counseling classes back in Chicago, I would have the students do a little exercise. And the majority of them came back and said, yes, I have rights. And I would say, well, what are your rights based on? And you know what they gave me invariably? I have rights because of the Constitution. Well, that's not the concept that we should be examining as far as our rights are concerned. That man-made document gives us certain unalienable rights. But what rights does God give me as his creature? What rights does Christ give me as my Redeemer? And that's something that has to be understood and answered, because that's where fights often start at. If I stand up for my rights, it's going to cause a fight. It can very easily cause a fight. Didn't Jesus have a bunch of rights, supposedly, while he was here on earth? Even Paul says, I have the right to take a believing wife like the Apostle Peter. But he says, I choose not to exercise that right. Rights that cause fights are blights. Are blights, B-L-I-G-H-T-S. I tried to find a word that would rhyme, and that's the closest one I came to years ago, okay? It's a blemish that takes place. In reality, if you take a look at it from a spiritual point of view, the only right you have from God's perspective is the right to punishment for your sin, right? You don't have the right to have a house, to have clothing, to have a job, to have money, to have food, to have a nice place to live, to be able to travel, to have a car, to have a boat, to have a gun. You don't have any of those rights. Those are blessings and privileges that God has granted to you out of his grace and out of his mercy. Now, the only debt that we have, according to the Apostle Paul, is the debt of love for one another. The debt of love for one another. So when we are fighting for rights, we're seeking to take something away from someone else and retain it for ourselves. That is a communication problem, isn't it? In 29, verse 20, I guess I figured out part of that verse. Chapter 29, verse 20. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. What's a communication problem? Hasty in our words. Not thinking. What disciple, what follower of Jesus Christ had hoof and mouth disease, who was hasty in his words? Do you know? It's Peter.
Peter.
Yeah, Peter. Always hoof and mouth disease. Not thinking. Now, when he finally got under control by the Holy Spirit of God, that greatly changed in his life. I don't want to be called a fool because I'm hasty in my words. And then verse 21, I think this is the last one here. He who pampers his slave from childhood will in the end find him to be a son. What in the world does that have to do with communication? Stop and ponder that for a moment. Here is a person, an owner, who has slaves, and a couple who are slaves has a child underneath his rulership, underneath his mastery, whatever you want to call it. And so he begins to pamper that little boy. And all through the developmental years of that little boy, he pampers that little boy. The boy's a slave, but he pampers him. And the result of that, according to verse 21, he's going to wind up looking like a son. He's going to wind up looking like a son. You're not going to be able to tell the difference of blessing and benefit between the actual biological son and the slave because of how the boy was treated. What does this do with communication? Many times, is it not, beloved? Many times, there are communication problems on how to raise your children. How to raise your children. I don't think anybody on the broadcast who is tuned in tonight or who will listen in the days ahead that any parent can say, we've never had a problem with raising our children. There will be differences on how to raise the child. Why is this? Why is this? I thought we were both Christian. I'm a Christian woman who I love my husband, and I love God, and I want to be a great mother. I'm a Christian dad. I love God. I love my wife. I want to be a great father. We should be on the same page, right? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Carolyn came from a home with a mother and a father, and she had two siblings, which really she raised as a surrogate mother because they came after she was older. She would often tell me that she changed more diapers in her youngest sister's life than her mother did. And they took family vacations. They had really, really great times. Wonderful, wonderful memories that she had. Pictures galore of trips that they took up in Canada and sitting around the Christmas table and different things like that. Her dad her mom and dad basically were absentee parents when it came down to raising the children, raising their daughters. Her mother often said to her, I would not know what to do if I had a boy. She was scared to death. She barely watched our oldest son for 1 hour after I got a motorcycle down in Florida and I wanted to take Carolyn for a ride. She was petrified. I was raised on the streets of Chicago. My father wasn't in my life. My mother was a prescription drug addict. I stole to survive. I stole food from a Jewish delicatessen. The guy knew I was doing it, but he never turned me in. And I had a whole different life. Holidays? Oh my goodness. Holidays started out very, very nice. Everybody was all happy until about an hour into the situation, and my mother, Helen, would provoke an argument with her sisters, and the fur flied. They left, and here we were stuck with her anger and her disposition. Holidays were not nice for me. I do not have a fond memory of a joyful holiday in all of the years prior to marrying Carolyn. And it was somewhat of a struggle between us because of all of her expectations that she had and how she was raised and how I was raised about these things. And even raising our children, I had to really grow and mature. And she had to allow me to make mistakes as a leader. That's what we're talking about here in verse 21. I don't want to pamper my children to where I excuse their sinfulness and I tolerate their rebellion. There is a biblical order, and the biblical order is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. It is very, very clear. Christ is the head of man. Man is the head of the woman. God is the head of Christ. There's the biblical structure. So you have God, Christ, man, and then next to man, woman, and underneath them, children. That is the biblical structure. My children are not to be raised as my friends. They are not to be raised as my peers. I need to respect the image of God in them, but I'm going to have to give an accountability on how I brought them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And I certainly don't want the Lord to remind me that you tolerated this in your son, you tolerated this in your daughter. Now, I guess I'll close with this comment and then we'll open it up for anybody who's got any insights or thoughts. If you establish biblical standards in the home and your kids are being influenced by ungodly influences, even in a youth group at a church, that's where our problem started at the church that we were going to with our kids. I'm still in charge. God is still in charge through me to them, and they're not going to appreciate it. They're not going to like it. And they will push back using, well, we do this all the time down the youth group. Well, I wish I was a part of that family over there. They let their kids get away with anything. Well, bless you, my child, but God put you in my family, and He has given me authority and charge over you. And I regret that you are chafing underneath the bit. But this is the structure. This is the structure. Next week we are going to conclude this section on communication with 13 communication guidelines, some do's and don'ts. Some do's and don'ts. and we'll cover this next time that we get together next Tuesday, and then we will be embarking on a new area of study. Now, if any of you have any ideas, suggestions, inquiry about what you might like to study, let me know. I have something, probably half a dozen things that we can go. But if you have something specific, please let somebody know.